Grüezi ragazzi, bienvenue und willkommen to Cannabiscientia's LinkedIn Live sessions. Today we have Olga Nikolajev, who is a death doula, and I'm very happy to have seen one of her presentations before, and I thought it was eye-opening. It was something I had never thought about before. But then once we started talking and once I started learning from you, I was like, why are we not talking about this? We should all be talking about this. It's part of all of us and all of our lives. So being able to discuss it and in a constructive and supportive environment is just, thank you for opening my eyes to the importance of this. So everyone, I'm very excited you're here, and hello to everyone who's going to watch the recording later. Just a reminder, drop questions in the chat. I'll post them later at the end so we can discuss. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Olga. And tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's dive right into it.
Thank you so much, Christina, for inviting me to continue to share some of my own personal, professional insight in relationship to maybe why we don't talk about death and dying and grief, how did we get here, and where do doulas fit in, and how we might be actually sort of forging a future into hopefully more compassionate communities in which families can really engage in the process and are supported not only by their healthcare provider, palliative care, hospice care providers, but also maybe including end-of-life doulas, death doulas, as part of the care team, which I think is really, really valuable. So if you can put up this slide, before I do my own introduction, I think it's really worthwhile. You know, this is a habit that I've gotten into. It's not just a habit for the sake of doing a land acknowledgement, but also because I have had the privilege and the opportunity to work with a number of different First Nations, Métis, Inuit community members across our country. So as always, I wanted to really do this land acknowledgement and to acknowledge and honor the ancestral guardians, the Métis, the First Nations and Inuit people of the land and waterways of Canada, and to also acknowledge that not only do the Indigenous peoples and the various expressions of Indigenous culture continue to call these lands home and act as their stewards, but it is also the responsibility of those who are settlers, who are immigrants. I am a first-generation immigrant, actually a refugee in some sense, you could say, from communist Czechoslovakia in 1980. So I absolutely am very, very thankful to be part and live on this land. And so it's part of my responsibility to make sure that I take care of this land for generations to come. And not just the next generation, not my generation, because I don't have any, I didn't make any people, but certainly for the 7 generations to come, so that we can secure our resources and be really able to connect to the land. One of the things that often some of the Indigenous folks that I have the privilege to speak with and to work with, and as well as be friends with, they oftentimes really encourage me to walk the land, go out and, see where the waters are, what the trees are local, what are the local plants to your environment. It's a really nice way to connect. And we already know that nature has a really soothing way of calming us, and a way for us to feel connected. So a little bit of a longer land acknowledgement. So here I am. I'm going to talk to you today, and we're going to hopefully engage in some interesting conversations. Christina's going to follow the question. If there's something that you have, I will answer it. But let us spend some time, and I'll share with you what end-of-life doulas are all about, death doulas, the many different names that they go by, and how they are really forging this concept of community death care, which is really enabling families and those of us who've really been separated from death and dying and taking care of those who are at the end of life, how we can learn to do that again, so that we can be more empowered and be able to actualize the wishes for our own end of life care support. So as you see there, I've got a couple of letters behind my name. So I am a registered nurse. I started my nursing career in my early 20s. And surprisingly, I started as a labor and delivery nurse. Figure, how did that happen? How did we go from the beginning to the end? Well, what I realized in my training, and as a labor and delivery nurse, was that there was really not a lot of intervention in birthing, laboring. There were ways to intervene and to reduce pain, or when there were difficulties, to ensure that there was safety for the mom and the baby. But it was really more, I started to see it more as that social, very engaging kind of a process, right? Really had a huge impact on the family, not only the nuclear family or the immediate family, but certainly the birth of the child had a huge effect on the extended family and community, and so on and so forth. And I also saw that there were a lot of cultural practices that were part of laboring and birthing. And so I, unfortunately, in the early 90s, there was no work in Ontario. Surprise, surprise, for nurses. And so I ended up actually moving to British Columbia, had a amazing opportunity to kind of see the country from a different perspective, because I am located in Ontario primarily. And the only work that I was able to get was to work in a long-term care home. And so this is where the caring for the dying really kind of bloomed for me. And again, I saw some gaps. I saw that as a nurse, I could manage some pain, I could manage nausea, but I had gaps in understanding the spiritual nature, the emotional nature, the social, and the, again, maybe religious or ritual nature of end-of-life care support. And so that actually led me to go back to school. I have a diploma in nursing. At one time, we had diploma nurses. And so, yes, I'm that old. And I went back to school to gain more insight into the psychology of health and wellness and death and dying, as well as I wanted to learn some of the cultural background that exists. And so that led me to, again, really study ritual practices related to death and dying, be involved in a number of different Indigenous communities during my studies. And then I also, again, worked as a nurse in primary care. I worked in chronic illness care, and eventually worked as a palliative care nurse in the community. I also, so that's my RN there. The MA is, I have a master's in religion and culture. So once I had sort of the taste of being a student, and I consider myself kind of a professional student, forever taking courses. I'm currently enrolled in a PhD program. And so I wanted to really study how, especially newcomers, were able to enact some of their rituals related to funerals or death or body disposition, especially when they were quite different and diverse from sort of what was happening in Canada. And so my research really focused on the funeral death rites of Sikh and Hindu community members, and how the community and even the businesses, in this case, a funeral home, actually created a very special crematorium in which it really included and brought in those cultural norms of involving the family. And so that expanded even more of my sort of curiosity around cultural differences and sort of these social maybe shifts and changes that occur when there might be that collide or a merging together of different cultures. And then that also led me, I've always been very, very interested in altered states of consciousness, or what's, or non-ordinary states of consciousness. So again, from the perspective of sort of death or near dying, as well as from the perspective of ritual, of ceremony, as well as sort of the what are called sort of maybe non-ordinary states of technologies, which might be things like the use of psychedelics or entheogens. So the use of some of those substances like magic mushrooms or MDMA, and especially now, how are they being used within end-of-life care support? So as you can see, that really broadened a lot of my interest in looking at really expansive ways of understanding end of life and death and dying. So let me come back then to why, where do I fit in related to end of life doulas? So the FT that you see there actually stands for fellow in thanatology. And most people's reaction is thana what? And thanatology is actually the study of death and dying, grief and bereavement. And so I have been not only working in palliative care, hospice care, both as a nursing clinician, but also as a hospice palliative care planner within our healthcare system in Ontario. And probably about 10 years ago, intensely, I really shifted into education. So some of my disclaimers, I guess, or affiliations are that I work for Douglas College as a part-time facilitator or training end-of-life doulas. They have a program that is open for all. I also work for Centennial College, which has a thanatology program, so also facilitating some of those courses. I have my own entrepreneurship business called dyingmatters.ca, which is really an education social enterprise to enable people access to education around their different options and choices related to end-of-life care. And I've also, during the pandemic, in the midst of all of our isolation, birthed the Death Doula Ontario network as a way of gathering doulas in Ontario together to help them to continue their learning, to support each other, and to really put forth some education around what doulas do and what they don't do, and how they can help others through the process. I've also been part of and continue to be part of a number of different national and international organizations, one of them being the Association of Death Educators and Counselors, who actually certify people in thanatology and give them that status of fellow in thanatology after a peer review. I'm also a board member of the End of Life Doula Association of Canada, which is the national organization that's really spearheading a lot of the end of life doula scope and practice, and really working across Canada and internationally with other folks who are researching what are doulas doing. Why is this such a kind of a reawakening social movement that really is enabling us to speak about and have more safe places to speak about end of life, death and dying, grief. And I've also been part of Educanation. I am still part of that organization, again, another national organization that really is advocating for and educating people so that they can better understand, the medicinal properties and the wellness properties of cannabis and how it can be used, again, for people who might be navigating a cancer diagnosis, and many, many other different ways that cannabis can be helpful across the lifespan for many different disorders, for many, many different reasons. So lots more to talk about there. So for the sake of talking about end of life doulas, I wanted to kind of muddy the water a little bit here and to say that not everybody will call themselves an end of life doula, death doula, and this slide just shows some of the various ways that people kind of self-identify in relationship to the kind of work that they do in their communities. One of the things that you may not know is that doulas are actually self-regulated. So very similar to birth doulas, in which they are offering a non-medical support that offers practical, emotional, spiritual support to the person birthing or dying and those that are caring for them. It really is, as I said, a self-regulated position. So we don't have sort of a college, like a college of nurses or a college of physicians, to oversee our professional conduct. The End of Life Doula Association of Canada is not a foreseeing, looking over the doulas, but certainly is serving as sort of a public, kind of a public vetting of doulas, if you will. So in order for a doula to be a registered member with the End of Life Doula Association of Canada, they actually have to put forth an application of the training that they've done, their experience as an end of life doula, their ongoing educational plan. and then really engage with the organization to ensure that they have that ongoing training. So you may find people, again, call themselves by many different names. I have also found throughout my work that sometimes doulas adjust their name based on the fact that many people kind of contract when you call yourself a death doula. I certainly have this happen many times over the last 10 years when I tell someone, oh, what do you do? I'm a death doula. There's kind of this, this shrinking away, and then there's a leaning in, oh, what is that? And then we expand the conversation. Certainly, there are also doulas who may specifically kind of highlight maybe within their name the focus of their particular services. Maybe, transition guide might give sort of a little bit of that cue or indication that the doula sees the death process as a transition. So again, not all doulas are created exactly the same. One of the things that has happened in this social movement of doulas rising, and I'll speak to this in a minute, is that there's kind of huge increase in different forms of training of doulas. You can do an online course for $65 and have a certificate of completion and never meet an instructor, or you can take, a full 1 year sort of course where there's hands-on and there's in-person process and mentorship. So there is not one particular course that is being offered. And so that also muddies it a bit, that while doulas, again, are non-medical and provide that compassionate care that is both practical and providing practical, emotional, spiritual support, the way that they do or provide their services can vary. Can absolutely vary. And now I'm also seeing that some of the doulas are calling themselves chronic illness doulas, because that sort of signals to folks that we can still help in having some of those conversations, advanced or more of, but also in advance conversations around our wishes and what is important, especially at the end of life. So here we are. We've gone 17 minutes already, and we're just reaching the objective. So I'm hoping in the last 40 minutes or so, or that we have together, you'll have some insight into the historical roots and the emerging future of end-of-life doula work. I'll speak a little bit about the scope and practice, about what doulas do and what they don't do, their primary sort of methodology or their perspective or approach to care. And then we'll go into a few of the practical tools that might be helpful for you specifically to kind of engage on your own or with your friends or with your family to start the conversation. And I'll give you some sort of questions that you might want to ask and a couple of resources. And I'll also share some of the resources that doulas have used within their community, engaging families in these conversations. And then we'll also have an opportunity, it seems like a lot that we're going to get done in the next 40 minutes, for you to kind of do a little assessment in relationship to death literacy. Where am I at in relationship to hands-on? Do I know how to feed someone, who's in bed? Can I have a conversation with someone who's newly bereaved about what they might be going through? And then maybe create a plan for yourself so that you can gain some more knowledge and some more learning, so you have more confidence and competence to have some of these conversations. So let's talk. I always like to use a little bit of humor. I think using humor in the field of thanatology is always really helpful. There's something that happens in our brain where we open up to the humor, and then we're therefore opened up to maybe some new information, especially information around death and dying. So consider that there is a birth and death connection, right? Birth and death are the entry points either to the physical form reality or the exit or entry points of the afterlife, if you will, or the no matter. There is no matter, the formless. spiritual nature of things. I don't think I'm the only one who has a sense that something exists beyond the physical reality, something that I can't necessarily even see or comprehend, or maybe even experience in this physical form. And so both of these events are really charged with all of that holistic energy, if you will. There's emotion, physicality, emotionality, some of the mental processes, certainly the spiritual process is part of the birth and death phenomenon. And that it, again, is a non-medical event, although you can also see that birth also, can have untoward consequences where death also occurs, maybe of the infant, of the child, but also potentially of the mother. So consider that we used to, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I think, especially let's focus on Western or the northern kind of hemisphere, I guess. We had high mortality rates even in birth, and so through advances, medical advances, through even sanitation, that has improved the ability and the vitality of live births. And so in the same way, we may have had more people dying of simple infections or different accidents, and so, or even different illnesses. But again, advances have kind of allowed us to live, not kind of, have allowed us to live longer. But that also means that we live with more complicated comorbidities. So multiple different illnesses, we may be living longer, but again, maybe with more complex sort of physical or mental or spiritual issues into our dying days. So there's a relationship between birth and death connection. Again, doulas fundamentally are a non-medical, compassionate approach, really working in the communities. And again, because doulas right now are self-regulated, they're not, some of them might be, there's a bit of a start of doulas being hired by organizations that can enhance the care that they're already providing, which I think is great. But doulas also serve as educators in the community. So really facilitating those conversations with families, or, hosting death cafes, or hosting some of those sort of public events to really generate some interest and some of those conversations. I think doulas, it's also good to mention that, doulas isn't really a new concept per se. It's really an informal, non-medical support person. You may have seen some of the literature when you're looking at end-of-life doula kind of historically. You may see that there's an identifying to sort of the Greek word meaning doula, servant, one who serves. There is a bit of a lineage to sort of doula referencing a slave who was providing that kind of support during the Greek times, Roman Empire, I guess, for the laboring mothers. And so there's a bit of that, maybe a historical stigma, but fundamentally doulas are to serve the person, the dying person, and their family. So that's a really interesting concept, because in some way doulas, and I speak to this when I'm training doulas, I call doulas bridgers. I call them the bridge to maybe for the person who's at the end of life and their understanding. So providing information, engaging in developing questions they can ask their person, but also bridgers to community resources, bridgers to some of the legal understanding related to decision-making process, bridge to finding out different options and choices related to body disposition and funeral options. Consider that in the Western, in Canada, let's focus on Canada, we have a very siloed system, right? The medical system doesn't usually speak to the legal system until it has to. And then the funeral system doesn't necessarily speak to the medical system. And so families oftentimes find that they are kind of handed off to the next expert professional. And what they are sometimes seeking, often seeking, are to better understand and to bridge and to help them to understand the things that they may not even have thought of. And so this is where doulas come in. Because they don't belong to any particular silo, they can help the family to gather the information and source the community resources that they need to really help them to understand those different sort of processes along the trajectory of end-of-life care. And so, and I might speak to that a little bit later. Some of the folks who are really in the field, like Henry Frisco-Weiss, he is, I believe Henry is a social worker. He began in NELDA, which is the International Network of End-of-Life Providers in NELDA. You might have to look that up, Christina. I think I have it as a resource on my last slide. But this is from his book, Finding Peace at the End. So he's kind of one of the primary folks who started the end-of-life doula movement. And so he really sees the doulas being very focused on the dying experience. So as you see there, you know, involving and reflecting on the person's life and maybe doing some legacy work or some life reviews so that we can have the ability to kind of self-reflect. What have we learned? Do we have any regrets? Do we have any fears? Do we have any concerns? And then the doula would focus on, with the client, with the family, on how to alleviate some of those particular concerns, you know, and how to maybe access more information or what is needed so that the person can really actualize the last few days of their life to be really reflective of who they are as a person, their particular values, their wishes, and have, you know, have sort of the death not be as a thing that you need to move away from, but really the acknowledgement and the crescendo, I guess, of your life to really see this as an opportunity to do that life review and really plan for something that can be not necessarily not painful, but could also be beautiful in a lot of cases. And then Henry also identifies that doulas, again, are really there close to the dying or after the death to really help the family kind of reprocess or debrief the experience, to ask any more questions, and then to help them to find the resources related to bereavement. So let's talk a little bit about the scope and practice of end-of-life doula work. And I'll come back again through those three areas where doulas find themselves. So in the process of dying, at the moment of death, holding vigil, and then after death. So this is from, as you see here, from the End-of-Life Doula Association of Canada. And again, it reiterates some of what I've already mentioned, where doulas provide emotional, educational, practical support that really empowers the client to make informed decisions regarding their end-of-life care. So it's really about engaging in those conversations, identifying what those wishes are, what are the values, potentially maybe having conversations as well with substitute decision makers or executors. Who are the folks who are going to enact if they need to? In the case of a person who's dying, may or may not lose their mental capacity, but who will be the people who will enact those particular wishes and who will have that authority and responsibility. As you see there, the approach that doulas have is to be respectful, non-judgmental, really encouraging clients' wishes to be heard and fully understood. So it's a very engaging process. It's not kind of a hierarchical, I'm the doula telling you what to do, I'm the expert, but a very engaging. When I meet with client families, I often do what I can to kind of situate myself on the same level. I may know some information around sort of process of end-of-life care support, but they are the expert in those values and beliefs that are really going to govern that journey. And so all I'm really doing is, through those open conversations, gaining some insights into those values, and then being able to give them information of maybe the expectations or what are the factual realities that are happening in end-of-life care. I can tell you that for many of us, we assume that we will have the care when it's needed. And it doesn't always happen, because often, you know, we are in a culture that resists, that wants to deny, or even some have said that is ignorant to death. What I would say is that our denial and the refusal and the resistance to talk about death and dying is actually a very natural process. It's really not, I wouldn't really call it pathology. I think that, yes, there are mental health disorders such as thanatophobia, which is a type of anxiety that can be very debilitating. But for probably 80% of the population, our resistance to these conversations, I would say, is more so based on our social sort of conditioning. And so consider that probably in the last 50 years, most family members haven't really had, or there's been a diminishment of their engagement in the care of the person at the end of life. And so the caring has really been allocated to the professionals and to healthcare. And so that leaves a gap. And this is where doulas have kind of risen to the occasion to say, we are willing to engage and open these conversations so that people have some more comfort with the discomfort of dying, death, and grief. And then end-of-life doulas also provide support and really connect folks to the resources within their community. Again, why I really encourage doulas to take training from within their province, within their country, because hopefully that facilitator will give them some more maybe insider information, insight into the healthcare system and what is in place, what are the gaps and challenges, especially in relationship to caring for people, obviously at the end of life. So here's what doulas don't do. Doulas do not hasten death. Doulas do not counsel anyone on how to die. It is actually still a criminal offense to counsel or to direct someone on how they could even end their own life. Doulas, again, are not ones who provide medical assistance in dying. They do not. That is only being able to be provided by a physician or a nurse practitioner. But consider that the public hasn't necessarily had a lot of education around doulas. And so sometimes there is a bit of that association. Doulas, because they fundamentally are advocating for the rights of the person, and in some cases for the rights of the person to access MAID, have had that a little bit of that association. But fundamentally, doulas are not only related to medically assistance in dying. They help support that process really as part of the family caregiver team. And they also may very much follow in providing support for somebody who's navigating a natural death. They don't perform any medical tests or diagnosis. So although me as a nurse, I could be a doula, I want to make sure that in my doula role or with my doula hat, I'm not doing any of my nursing things, because those are very different scopes of practice and very different even responsibilities and legal responsibilities related to the tasks that I perform. Doulas don't give any advice or make any assumptions. They may advise in relationship to information that might be missing, or they might also make referrals, because doulas are not lawyers. They're not funeral directors. So they can liaison and connect client families to the resources that they need. They also don't often care for the decedent. So meaning that they are not personal support workers. They are not nurses. So at this point, doulas really in their scope are not providing some of that personal care, like washing people, dressing people, toileting people. They may support people eating, but again, some of that might be very doula specific, because there are some skills that and knowledge you need to know in order to do that safely and well, especially when people are at the end of life and they may have some issues related to being able to swallow or being very weak. Again, in that non-judgmental, compassionate approach, doulas do their best not to judge or push any beliefs. So a lot of the training also involves sort of self-reflection. Most death education, thanatology, end-of-life doula, palliative care, hospice care has an element of self-reflection, because so deeply rooted into death and dying are cultural and social sort of practices and norms, beliefs. And so we want to make sure that we are working with folks from all kinds of different backgrounds. We want to make sure that we're not sort of overlaying our own agenda or belief. And that we also acknowledge the fact that doulas do not replace anybody in the hospice palliative care team. We are an adjunct, we enhance the care. And so I really stress to doulas to not be the only person providing support, and get client families connected to their community hospice palliative care or their primary care provider for more support. Here's what doulas do. I always laugh when I say do. Doulas can find themselves as part of the process earlier. They, as I mentioned, they don't belong to any silos, so they really follow the trajectory that the family is navigating. They try and remain neutral and as objective as possible, again, having some of that cultural humility training and really recognizing that often beliefs and values are so deeply rooted in personal sort of ideals and perspectives. They see death not only as an event, because it is, but also the process of dying, acknowledging that there is a process. And sometimes while we may have comfort in talking about death, the dying part and the planning for the, what's to come, or even to plan for maybe a plan A, plan B, plan C, because we don't always know. Dying can be quite mysterious, and we don't always know when the person will die or how they will necessarily die. Not everybody will die of their illness. Consider that there are people who may have a cancer diagnosis, but they may die of a simple infection or pneumonia because they are already in their end of life. And so there are complexities in their physical illness. We are absolutely person and family centered, but so is hospice palliative care. We provide emotional, practical, informational support. We're there to encourage, advocate, and empower. Sometimes, again, that's a unique thing to doulas. We really advocate, again, I think healthcare providers also advocate in different ways. But it's that bridging those silos that I find doulas in that unique sort of position, because we don't belong to any particular kind of industry or field. We can bridge that information, and that we're aware of the signs of dying and also understand the legalities. So also understanding and giving some information to families related to expected deaths at home, related to where to find information around medically assisted and dying. Also being aware of what can happen when there's an unexpected sudden death. Although that's not the primary training for most end-of-life doulas, there is some of that as well. Here's a very, very busy chart, which really comes from some research that has been done, and I can certainly be able to share that with you. But there's some of the research that has already been done related to end-of-life doulas is that, as you see here, they can offer a number of different services before someone dies. And those things can be companionship, and navigating advanced care planning conversation. Even before somebody is ill and has a life-limiting illness, those could be had, and doulas can be really instrumental in opening up those conversations. Again, in the active dying process, that's really the component of companioning and vigiling, really being present. Consider that when most people are at the end of their life and in the actively dying process, they may actually be they might be alone. In hospital, they would certainly not have a nurse sitting by their side. Even in a residential hospice, they wouldn't necessarily have a nurse sitting by their side. So a doula can sit with families. They can provide respite before the person is in that sort of more active process of dying, but certainly serve as a really compassionate presence when the person is dying, and be a resource to family and caregivers. And then offer some of that post-death coordinating related to funerals, related to ceremonies, related to different ritual practices, and get folks connected or provide some grief and bereavement after the death has occurred. Again, this is just another sort of illustration, sort of expanding it a little bit more, saying, hey, doulas could be really helpful even for folks who are healthy. again, having some of those advanced care planning conversations, right? Do you know who would care for you if you were not mentally capable to make decisions on your behalf? That fundamentally has nothing to do with end of life. And so doulas are taking that on as a way of generating those conversations in the community. I want to kind of speed up a little bit. So let me, I love this little slide. So John Underwood is the person who started death cafes. Some of you may be familiar with death cafes or have attended death cafes. And death cafes are a public, safe spaces where people are able to talk about anything related to death and dying, grief and bereavement. There is no agenda. There is no sort of agenda to have you, to train you or to educate you. It's just an exploration of these conversations. And so John Underwood took some of the insight from a psychiatrist who facilitated death over dinner and sort of thought this would be a really great thing to introduce to the public as a way of generating some of these conversations. I've held a number of death cafes in person and online. I host the Death Cafe with the Doulas, and that is on the last Sunday morning of every month. The last Sunday of every month from 9:30 to 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can find the link on the Death Doula Ontario Network.ca and join us for Death Cafe with the Doulas. And so those are, again, really great avenues to have the conversation, get the conversation started. So I would encourage you to have a look. Maybe there's a death cafe happening in your own neighborhood. And so let us now sort of in the closing part, if you will, this will engage you hopefully a little bit more as I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and we're going to go through the death literacy domains and some of the questions that are there for you to assess your own death literacy. So as you see here, death literacy defined by Carrie Noonan, who's a social researcher in Western Australia, and they've defined it as a set of knowledge and skills that make it possible to gain access to understand and act upon end-of-life and death care options. Kathy Cortez Miller, she wrote a little book called Talking About Death Won't Kill You. She is a palliative care social worker up in Northern Ontario. And so she defines death literacy involving the skills and knowledge required to plan for and support ourselves and others at the end of life. And so these are really, really great resources, folks that are in the field doing lots of different research and certainly raising death literacy. And so you may see this term. And so here are the domains. And so as you see here, Kathy or Carrie Noonan organized death literacy by addressing 4 specific sort of overarching domains. The first one being experiential knowledge, or one of them, not necessarily the first one. And this is really about, do you have experience yourself in caring for someone who is dying or grieving? What is the knowledge and the experience that you had? Is it negative? Did you have a negative experience and therefore have a bit of an apprehension around end of life? Or has it allowed you to reevaluate and to see what is important? So some of the questions that Carrie Noonan has devised in the experiential knowledge is, has the experience developed wisdom and understanding for you? Has it made you be more compassionate towards yourself? Are you able to, because of this experience, provide skills when, and support when facing challenges in the future? So this is really about the personal experience that you've had and where you might be at related to having a level of confidence or competence when caring for someone at the end of life. Then there is the factual knowledge. So those are things like, do you actually know the law regarding someone being able to die at home? Do you feel confident in knowing what documents you need in order to, for planning for death? Are you able to navigate the healthcare system related to hospice palliative care? Do you even know where to turn? Are you aware of funeral services and options? And so I'm reading out some of the questions that Carrie Noonan poses in this death literacy assessment. And so I'm just sharing you some of the examples, and certainly I can include the link so that you could potentially do this on your own or take it to your community, maybe to your family, right? Community doesn't necessarily mean just a big group of people. It could be a small group of people, your family and friends. What else? Another question is factual knowledge. I have sufficient understanding of illness trajectories to make informed decisions around medical treatments available and how that will shape my quality of life. Wow, that's a really, really big one, right? And that these questions don't necessarily result in a yes or no. They may actually need for us to acquire more information, right? And so they kind of spark and highlight what information we may not know. Most folks don't know what they don't know. And that's true. Then we also have some practical knowledge. And the practical knowledge, as you see on the slide there, is put together in being able to talk about, or having that talking support and hands-on care. So are you able to talk about dying and death or grief to a close friend? Are you able to talk about dying and death and grief to a child? Are you able to hold space and talk to a newly bereaved person? And are you able to talk to your primary care provider about support at home or the place of care as it relates to the dying person? So again, sort of these very quick assessments, and hopefully they will give people sort of some, I need to get some more information. The hands-on support is really related to being able to feed, lift, bathe the person, and administer medication. And the community knowledge, which I see on my on my notes that I didn't put in there, is really what are the support services in the community that can help the dying person and those that are caring for them, and what are the accessibility requirements, right? And so when I say accessing or accessibility, I'm talking about, eligibility criteria. What are the parameters? Does somebody need to be diagnosed with a life-limiting illness in order to access palliative care? What are the cutoff points or the entry eligibility criteria for someone entering residential hospice? So very much connected to some of that factual knowledge, right? You almost can see how those two are sort of connected. And so this assessment helps us to kind of better understand what the gaps might be and what the strengths and skills might be, and also where maybe some more information needs to be had. These are some of the resources that I'm introducing here to you. So the Death Doula Ontario Network, where you can find some more information around what doulas do and some of the initiatives that we're doing. The End of Life Doula Association of Canada, again, to find, more of a national framework related to doulas. And you'll also be able to find the scope and practice, as well as a repository of doulas across Canada. And then INELDA is the American organization that also governs the scope and practice. And I think they also have an initiative where they are now certifying doulas so that they have that organization to do that. And here we are. So I'm hoping that some of this information has given you some more insight into what doulas do and how they can help support. And hopefully we can engage with doulas a little bit more. I find too that sometimes this has been my experience in training end-of-life doulas, is that probably I would say 60% of the people who come to the training actually are seeking to find the information and the training for themselves and for their families, and that's a really big message that speaks to the fact that we actually don't have a lot of public education in relationship to end of life care. You may have seen, or I have certainly seen and have engaged, the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association, the national organization, is actually launched a program, a public program called Last Aid, the Last Aid, which is a program that was developed by emergency room doctor in Europe who saw the ability to really kind of use the approach of first aid at end of life. And so it offers within a 3.5 hour format very foundational knowledge in relationship to navigating end of life care process, as well as some insight into, natural dying. What does that look like? And that has been sort of an initiative that hopefully will increase some death literacy, but certainly we can't just rely on one. And so there's going to be more and more of this. I always say to doulas, I might be training you so that you can really educate your community and your own family and friends, so that we don't need doulas later, because we will once again have sort of in our community the ability of lay people being able to do this work in a way that, again, gives them that confidence or competence.
Thank you so much, Olga. This was wonderful. Again, I feel very lucky to be able to learn about this again, because every time we talk about it, I personally feel more empowered and more at ease. And I like what you mentioned about, hopefully one day we won't need professional doulas, because our community will be the one taking care of its own members, whether it's, within the nuclear family, expanded family, or chosen family, right? So it's fascinating. And you mentioned the Death Cafe last Sunday of every month, but I didn't catch the time.
So on the Death Doula Ontario network, and I can put the link in the chat, and you can post it on there. I host with other doulas the Death Doula or the Death Cafe with the Doulas. And so if you go onto the website and just scroll down, you'll find the little Death Cafe with the Doulas, and the link is right there, the Zoom link. We meet online over Zoom. And you'll also see that we're actually taking a little break July and August. I am all things related to Death Doula Ontario Network. I'm the founder, I'm the director, I'm the administrator, I'm the Zoom facilitator. So I need a little reprieve over the summer so that I can start planning for next year. Yeah. But it's an easy Google search. If you even folks go on to deathcafe.com, that's actually the international Death Cafe website that John and his wife started. He actually died, unfortunately, in 2017. 2017, I think it was. As I get older, time just seems to fly by. But his wife continues to do the work. And the Death Cafes have been kind of facilitated across the world, over 22,000 different death cafes in different countries and different formats by different folks. It's just a really interesting phenomenon where people gather because they're very curious, they're interested, and it is a safe space. No one's going to diminish you. No one's going to say, don't talk about that. I remember as a young nurse, having a conversation with someone around death and dying, and them actually having sort of reverse ageism on me, where they said, "You're too young to talk about death and dying." And I thought, wow, I said, and I think I remember saying to them, "Do you have a crystal ball that says that I will live a long life into my 90s? Like, how do you know? Death happens every day. There are some deaths that are natural, and there are the natural process of life, right? Everything organic on this planet will die." And I think that there are also deaths that are really traumatic and really unexpected. And, I think our society doesn't do well in planning, but we also, I don't think, are doing well in supporting people through some of those really tragic losses that they have experienced.
We have this tendency to not want to talk about anything that is not overly positive. there's a little bit of toxic positivity
Yeah,
I find in our society, at least where I live. Um, and I think it's freeing, it's liberating to be able to have these conversations in a neutral setting, because it is a very charged topic. And like you said, the example you gave with that person that assumed that you need to be older in order to know about death. I mean, I see their perspective too, because just mathematically, as you get older, you have more chances of interacting with death situations. But at the same time, I feel like that person was kind of marginalizing the topic and saying we shouldn't be talking about this. You, as a young person, you should not be focusing on this bad thing. And it's not a bad thing, right? It's just part of life, just as much as birth is part of life. And for me, that really shifted my view on life a little bit. Like, this is the balance. Why have I been out of balance for so long?
yeah,
We celebrate birth, and it's good, but I think that being able to hold the opposite as well, and hold it while being neutral, I think that is very important personal growth for the living. So I'm very, very just, I don't know, empowered, and I feel like this is such an important topic, and I will get more educated myself. And I've definitely been curious about death cafes. I just recently found out about them, but again, very, very interesting concept and very needed in our society.
yeah.
Amazing.
I
And
just
then,
went to a Death Over Drafts. Death Over Drafts event in Ottawa. So that's, you're going to see once you get plugged into this particular death and dying algorithm, you'll then start to notice many other spaces that are opening up to have these conversations. So this is deathoverdrafts.com is another initiative, that had maybe started in one part of the world, and all of a sudden somebody's saying, that's a great idea. I got a little pub or a little brewery. Hey, maybe I can contact them. Right. So it can be anything. I often, have those conversations with doulas who don't know how to start. It's really difficult sometimes as a new emerging doula. Like, how do I kind of put my shingle out there? And so what I really encourage them to do is to be part of their community and to host a death cafe or death chats or advanced care planning conversations. Just start offering people some basic information to get the conversation going, because it'll be a good way for them to get to know you, and then to see if they actually want you to help with their family. Right. I find, again, it's a new emerging, in some way it's always been there, but it's kind of emerging once again because the need is there. People oftentimes feel very demoralized by their experience in the healthcare system. And again, because it doesn't necessarily have the palliative care approach embedded in all. We're so focused on curing. We're just going to do onto you until we can't do onto you anymore, and then we'll hand you off to those dead people. So I like being the bummer at the party. I'm usually the one who talks about things death related. I think it's some say this is a calling. I think this has been a big part of my life. It's even sort of linked to ancestral lineage, if you will. I was named after my great grandmother, Olga, who was actually killed by the Bolsheviks in the 1918 Russian uprising. My heritage is lineage into Russia as well as Czechoslovakia. And so it's just an interesting sort of a legacy that I'm carrying, being named after, a murdered great grandmother by the political, whatever upheaval that was happening. And it just kind of percolated in the unconscious. My family also had a number of different losses that weren't necessarily revealed until I was an adult, but there was always been sort of this notion that death is not the grim reaper, but can actually give us an ability to have a different perspective. And, I would even say that even climate change, or us not including death as part of our conversations when we plan into the future, is why we are here now. We are, such as a society, so focused on, youth, and consuming without thinking about sort of the death cycle, if you will, right? And we need to include more of that because, like you said, many people think that death is the opposite of life, but it's not. Death is the opposite of birth. Life is what happens in between and then some.
Wonderful, wonderful way to wrap it up. And just before we go, I just want to say a quick thank you to our organizer, Viola Brugnatelli. And I want to encourage you to check out cannabiscientia.com. And we have the second edition of the Principles of Clinical Cannabinology coming out, I believe, in September, which I'm very excited about. But yeah, thank you so much, Olga. And I've shared a number of your resources, but if any questions pop up in the chat after we finish off, I'll collect them and I'll reach out to you.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks again, Christina. This
Thanks
has been
again.
fun.
Have a good week, everyone.